Hey guys, Hawk20 here. This is a Blender Basics video. Now, for those of you who are watching, these videos aren't intended for people who have little to no experience with 3D modeling or even Blender in general. Now, I'm not saying that those that are watching that have considerable experience or even more professional won't really get anything out of this. In fact, I actually invite you guys to participate in the comments section below, since, you know, I may not know everything and it might actually help me to learn a few things from you guys as well. So if you guys do contribute anything to the comment section, I am considerably thanking you for that. So without further ado, let's get on with this series. Alright, so you're ready to start modeling. Well, you don't really know what to do, but you're ready to start anyway. Anyway, if you've downloaded Blender, you've looked at it probably already and have absolutely no idea how any of it works. If that's you, then this is okay. This first episode is meant, or I guess in this case episode or video, whatever you wish to call it, is intended to get you familiar with some of the basic controls and how to do things in Blender. So, first upmost, one thing that is going to be required for using Blender is a mouse. Honestly, if you're using a trackpad from a laptop, or if you're using a tablet for those OS player subscribers of mine, I really suggest you don't do that. You're going to want a computer mouse, as well as that computer mouse having a mouse 3 or scroll wheel. The main reason I say this is because mouse 3 is actually used to rotate this camera, as you can see right now. It's very important that you have that. If you don't have that, it gets a lot... it gets pretty difficult to just do about anything, as rotation is pretty common when you're trying to do reference points. Another thing that you will also notice is I'm also panning the camera. Panning the camera is done by holding Shift key, and then also holding down your mouse 3, and then moving it as you see fit. You can pan in any direction, rotate, and pretty much do just about anything to adjust your view. Now, speaking of views, there's a few things that are extremely helpful with modeling. If you've watched some of my videos, or at least some of my live streams, you probably have seen me do this a few times. So, Blender, and as well as several other modeling softwares, have basically viewpoints. For example, this one is the front perspective, which is done by pressing the 1 on the numpad. Then you have the right perspective, which is similar to the front, except on the right side. This is done by pressing the 3 key. You've got the top perspective, which shows you the top down of the object you are working on. And that is also done by pressing 7. And you can also go and take care of the inverses. So if you press Control and 7, that'll give you the bottom. Control and 1 will give you the back, and Control and 3 will give you the left instead of the right. So these are extremely helpful if you have asymmetrical objects that you are trying to model. Of course, if you're doing something that is symmetrical in most forms, then you could probably get away with a frontal, a right or left, depending which way you like to look at it, and a top-down. Those 3 perspectives should be more than enough to get you what you need. But if, as I said, if you're doing an asymmetrical model, then you might need 4 or more perspective points to work with. Another thing I wanted to cover quickly is the idea of perspective versus orthographic. Now in perspective mode, we see the object as it is in 3D. You know, so we see the cube, we can see, you know, the depth pretty well and everything that it is. Now we have another mode called orthographic. Orthographic is basically a projection that basically says, let's take something that is 3D and make it look as if it was 2D. This doesn't look very much like it is in 2D when you look at it from this perspective, but when you apply the viewpoints, the front, right, top, bottom, left, and back, you can start to see how it really comes to shine that 2D kind of side to it. Something that is even more beneficial about the orthographic side is if you were to decide to use background images, or in this case reference photos, to kind of show or give you an idea as to how your model should look. Now you can do this by going to your shelf by pressing in, or you can press this tiny little plus sign that you can see in the top right corner of this window. Obviously, N's going to be a lot easier to do. Then you would go scroll down a little bit here, because you're actually going to see this first, so you just scroll down a little bit to background images, click the little checkbox, and then add image. Now there isn't an image set here, so I'm going to quickly go ahead and add one. Shouldn't take me too long here. Go ahead and let's just go ahead and use... some of you are going to get a laugh out of this, I think. So we'll just use good old Neptune pudding, for those of you who know where that's from. Props to you first off. So as you can see, now we have a background image to kind of work with as reference. This actually, let me go ahead and give you a better one to work with, because this is actually not as good of an idea to use. So I'm going to go ahead and go to this one. For those of you who saw this stream, you've probably recognized this already. So this is extremely helpful when you need to get an idea as to what you're looking at and want to use that as your base. So if I were to say go over here and start working on a model, I can go into wireframe mode and just go nuts with that. So I'll explain wireframe mode in a bit. Don't worry about that. So you can kind of see how this is extremely helpful. Now, the one thing you're going to want to focus on is if you want this to restrict to one specific perspective. So as you can see right now, I can see it on just about any of the perspectives that I choose. Top, right, front, back, and etc. If you want to restrict it to one specific one, for example, the right, you would go to where it says axis here, and then click on the right selection here. Now you won't see it anywhere but the right. Also, you need to make sure you are in orthographic mode for this to actually show, because if you go into perspective mode with the right perspective, you will not see it. So make sure that you are in orthographic mode when you use that. Alright, so with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get to the next stages that I wanted to mention real quickly. So, as you start to kind of mess around with this cube or whatever other primitive shape you wish to use, speaking of which, if you did want to add one, I'll go ahead and take care of that quickly. You'd press add down here, or I believe Control A works as well. Nope, that's not Control A. I forget which key it is. I will get back to you guys on that later. So you go down here, click on the add thing, go to mesh, and then select any of these primitives as you see fit. Now, if you guys see the little crosshair that is existing on our screen right now, that is the 3D cursor. When I select one of these shapes, it's going to send it to basically right there. And that will be the object's origin, which you can kind of see is depicted by this orange little dot right there. And it will send it there. If you want to put it to where the cube is, or center it, you can press Shift S, cursor to center, and then press Shift S once more and select selection to cursor. That will put it roughly where it should be. So, the next thing I wanted to talk about quickly is the idea and concept behind object mode versus edit mode, both of which can be selected from in the bottom left here. You have object mode and edit mode. Now, the difference between the two, there's quite a significant difference, and a lot of things will change depending on which mode you are in. So you need to be very careful when you're working in Blender that you don't accidentally mess up. So object mode treats individual entities as objects, meaning we can move them as we see fit without having any disturbance to the others. So this is extremely useful if we want to do simple translations, rotations, and etc. Now, edit mode changes things a little bit. Edit mode allows us to go individually into the object that we're working at. So in this case, this cube, and mess with individual pieces of it. So these little verts, as you see here, or these little points that represent the intersections of multiple lines. We can mess with these to change its individual shape rather than mess with the entire object as a whole. Think of edit mode as that let's actually get into it and fix it the way we want it to look. So there are three different types of selections, main selections that really are used in modeling. You've got the vertex mode or point mode, which you can kind of see is currently being used by me clicking on these little points all over the cube here. The next one is edge mode. That one reflects the line a bit more. So we're actually grabbing this line instead. Consider edge mode as if you're selecting 2 points. With face mode, you consider it as if you are selecting 4. Now, one thing I do want to point out is operations for transformation will change depending on which mode you're in and which selection you do. Of course, if you were just to select all 4 points here, you could have simply done that by pressing face mode and just clicking the face. So there's a million ways to do things. So kind of pick and choose which way you want to go. Obviously, if you're wanting to get it done quickly, you will want to do face mode because that makes things a lot easier for you. But nonetheless. One other thing I want to point out is if you were to add an object while in edit mode, so let's add another cube and move it over here. Now, the one thing that I want to point out is, as earlier as you saw, since we were able to move the sphere individually of itself and move the cube individually of itself, we were able to do that in object mode. When you switch back to object mode, you'll notice that this guy's lit up just like this one. Because we were in edit mode, when we added the cube, this cube was bound to this cube as well. So now they're considered an object while they are 2 individual objects, they're considered as one, and will move together when a translation or any other operation is done on them. So be careful when you're adding objects in, especially if you don't want this kind of scenario and you want these two objects to be separate, as these two are. So be careful with that. So, alright, now we're going to move on to the transformations shortly, and that'll be all for today. So, transformations are rather interesting. They're basically what makes modeling magic do its thing. So, the three major ones that I say are basically are the ones you're going to be using are translation, which you know to be like this, rotation, that's scale, rotation, which is this one, and scaling, which doesn't really show much, but you can kind of see it here. So, let's start off with translation. Translation is basically, let's move an object from here to here. In object mode, we move the whole thing. So in this case, if we were to press G or click the translate up here, we can move it based on how we see fit. If we press G or click on the translate button, we'll get more of a free mode translation, allowing us to basically put it anywhere that we feel we want to put it. Now, if we want more control on the translation, we can press G and then press X, Y, or Z. X, Y, and Z are going to basically bind the translation to the axis that we have pressed. So if we do about the X, it's going to be our red line we've got going across this way. If it's going to be our Y, we press Y, and that'll make it move about this way. Same thing with Z, except this one will be a blue line. If you're not sure what axis is which, there's a little icon down here in the bottom left of this window that'll show you exactly which axis is which. Usually, and I say this usually, what the standard is the X is always the red line, the Y is always the green line, and the Z is always the blue. So it's very easy to remember that once you get used to it. So, there's not really anything too different about translation in edit mode, as it does basically the same thing. But you need to be careful, obviously, since you don't want things going inside like this, because that looks weird. But we'll get more into that more when we do the modeling basics video. So, things will change when you do things like edges. So you'll be able to move 2 points instead of the whole block, or 1 point. And then face does the same thing with 4, rather than 1 or 2, or the whole object. So, where things really start to take off are when you do things like rotation. Rotation, it's fairly straightforward, we all know what it does. Rotates it. If we press R, or click our button up here, we can do the rotation as we see fit. Now again, just like we did with translation, X, Y, and Z keys will allow us to fine tweak those rotations about the axes. So if we press X, it does this way, Y does this way, and Z does this. So it's very handy if you need to have a really good control on where you're doing these rotations. Also, if you want to slow down any of your translations or rotations, you can press and hold the Shift key, and it significantly slows down that rotation process. Extremely helpful if you want to have a very minimal change. When you're satisfied with it, you press Enter, or you can simply just click. Either way should work. If you don't like what your change you've made, you can press Escape before that, and it goes back to what it was beforehand, which is fantastic. So, when we are in edit mode, the operation of rotation will change a little bit. Now, obviously, you can rotate a vertex. It doesn't do anything, but you can do it. So, since it doesn't do anything, regardless of what axis we're doing it on, there's no point to using it. Now, things change when you use an edge, or 2 points. When you rotate, it kind of deforms it in a way that makes it work. Now, you need to be careful when you do this, because you don't want this edge over here and this edge over here, because that makes things just look weird. So, and then same thing again with the face. If we were to rotate it, it's just about the same thing. But we need to be careful with that and make sure we don't freak out too much with it. So, alright. That will explain most of rotation. So the last one we have is scale. Scale also is very self-explanatory. You can make an object bigger, or you can make it really tiny. Doesn't really matter which way you go. Edit mode, very similar. If you do a vertex, scaling doesn't really do anything to just the vertex alone. If you do an edge, scaling does apply, but in only one way, really. As you can see, this line follows the y-axis, or our green line here. So if we did scale about the y, we can make that line bigger or smaller depending on how much we want. Also, if we were to go past that point where it's 0, we actually invert it. So it's a way of flipping it without actually trying to perform like a flip. So you need to be careful if you decide to do any scale that goes into the negatives. Again, since I said this goes about the Y, if we did an X scale, nothing happens, and same thing if we did a Z scale. So there's no point in trying to do those. Same. So if I grabbed here, though, I could do a scale with the X, but not the Y. So with a face, faces with scaling get a little interesting. It's actually extremely useful if you know how to really use it. So for those of you who have seen me do things like the No Game No Life chess piece that I did for my 100 sub video, this is kind of what I use. So what I'll do here is I'll scale up the face, and this makes just the face larger, so it kind of creates this almost like a rhombus look on the sides, or this, I'm not really sure what shape this was considered in some cases. It basically can be used to make like the bottom of like a lamppost or something. Very useful if you can find it, you know, if it works for your model. And I actually use this a lot when I model. I will grab a face and scale it up or smaller depending on how I see fit. So that is really how all that works, and those are all the transformations that are really important. There are obviously others, but the big 3 are translation, rotation, and scale, all of which you can find here or by pressing your hotkeys. Quick review, we have the user perspective, so you remember that we can use mouse 3 to move around the camera, and press shift and mouse 3 to move around the just pan. I should probably say it that way. We have our views, 1, 3, 7, 9. We can also use the inverted forms of them, which is control 1, 3, and 7, which do the same thing. Then we also have orthographic, which goes from a 3D to a 2D projection. Remember that the orthographic is needed for references, as you see here. So, alright, and then we have from there, we have the differences between object and edit mode, and the concerns with those two differences. And last but not least, we cover the transformations. So, alright, that will about do it for this first episode, so hopefully I didn't bore you guys too much. I'm sure for some of you this is a pretty boring thing, as most of you already know this concept. To others, this is probably something you've never seen before, and if it's blowing your mind, then just wait till you see what I've got to show you later on. Anyway guys, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video that I make or stream that I do. Until then, I will see you later.